Hello again, Eric.
Howdy.
You're in the open space?
I'm in one of the focus rooms.
Is the building busy?
No, it's a ghost town.
Just like X?
Yeah, I mean, there's more movement in the hallways because there's more people in this building, but most of them don't sit in this building. So if you like go to where people sit, there's nobody.
So Teja messaged earlier that she has a conflict. So it's probably going to be me, Akash, and maybe Nathan. Nathan has been joining
Okay.
as well. And Luis said he will be joining today.
Oh,
Have you
cool.
met Luis?
I think once before. I think he was on a call once before I dropped for my leave.
Yeah. So he mostly listens in from time to time just to see how the project's going.
Oh, cool.
I see Akash in the room. I also got an invite. Okay, so I'll talk about it offline.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's an internal Microsoft meeting.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. I forgot to close my door. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, I've shared the wrong screen. Just a second. Okay, I have the meeting notes loaded. Can everyone see my screen? I've just gone really dark, right?
A little, yeah.
Let me move the camera around. Like it has trouble adjusting the light sometimes. Okay, I think it's better now. Okay, let's get started. Oh yeah, so first thing, welcome back, Eric. It's really good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to be back. Thanks for letting me and my family take some time to figure out our new battle strategy. So we're good to go and good to be back.
I hope the baby sleeps through, and he'll be an easy baby, feeds well, and all that stuff. And when they eat well, they sleep well.
Yeah, they do. And when they don't, they don't.
Yeah, I try to keep in mind, like, they're growing, things are going to get better. It's only going to get better.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so two people in the waiting room, Jimmy and Sajay. Yeah, first actionable item, the update policy provider review from last week. I know, Eric, you said you have started going over it. Do you have some comments?
So I started going through it. So far I've reviewed, I think, almost every major file, and I just agreed with the comments that were already there. I didn't have anything specific that was new. So I think so far it looks good, and if I get to the end, then I'd probably just say, it gets +1 pending existing comments.
Yep, sounds good to me. Do you have any comments or notes, Akash?
I think it's almost there. Waiting on Teja's final review because she had talked about the whole default all versus default none policy we were discussing last week. So once she approves that, I think it should be good. But yeah, if anyone else wants to take a look.
So that was the default all versus default none. So the current default, as you have it implemented, is none.
Oh, it was none. So we had introduced like an extra policy called none, which was 0+, and then any is 1+, and then all is all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So previously, if you didn't specify an artifact type, but we found one, then it was treated as if we didn't care about it. So that's what the none policy was.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't require any of those type of artifact to be verified to true. But I think Tejo was saying that we should have the default policy be all, which is the most restrictive. So I guess in a security context, you want it to be the most restrictive. And if the user finds it too restrictive, they can override that and then ease that restriction. So they could go in and set the default policy to any.
Yeah, I have a little bit of mixed feelings. I guess I think having it more secure is good. The only case that I'm thinking about is a case where you have a shared registry where people things might get added to images or to the registry that are beyond your control that you would not want to brick you. So that would be the only thing that I would be cognizant of is cases where we might want the default behavior to be to ignore or to warn on certain things when they're new. So as long as we kind of meet in, I feel like we should meet in the middle on that. Like maybe we should have a warning for cases like that rather than just an explicit deny.
By warning, do you mean like, sorry, could you go a little bit deeper? How would we implement a warning?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from the like final decision, there's either an accept or a deny. So when I say a warning, that's more of like we would emit either to the admission controller, we could emit something, or through our own logs, we could emit something that's flagged as like a warning. And then people would have to pick that up the same way that right now you can, through Gatekeeper, you can fail open, but that failure is logged. And the idea is that if you have any like audit tracking or metrics or log capturing that you do, that you will deal with that in your own way. So that's when I say warning, that's all I really mean is we would make a note that happened in a way that somebody could capture it and do something about it, but it's not like official.
Okay, yeah, sure. I can add some warning messages in that scenario. Yeah.
I haven't looked at. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say. So what we're saying here is that we were looking towards setting the default up as all, and now we're talking about somebody could come in and add a signature or change something that would otherwise, break what we thought was already working. So, I mean, I guess that use case could certainly happen, but couldn't they just go back and change the policy to be any?
Yeah, that's doable. So
I mean, is it a policy for the entire ratify, or it's a policy for the individual verifier, right? The executor?
yes, yeah, it's for artifact type.
Yeah, so
yeah,
for artifact type, or for what is the scope? How granular can you get to it?
Right now I believe it's just artifact type.
Okay.
Just artifact type.
So,
okay.
And I guess unless something has changed since I've been away, the original any and all was added as like a very basic policy configuration, so to speak. And so we could get more into it here, or we could leave the more detailed policy for when we either add support for the Rego evaluation, or we talk about the pass-through thing that I think is on our agenda. But I don't know how far we want to take this policy before we move to something more complicated anyways. Right, yeah, the only thing I'm thinking about is that scenario where you have a shared registry and you have something that's working, and let's say some other team tries to sign the image you're using and it fails or whatever, the signature becomes invalid, then you're going to have some production outage because you can't like scale out with that image anymore, because Ratify is going to tell you that one of the signatures failed. That doesn't belong to your team. So that was my only concern. And that in the future, a use case like that might look like you saying that a image should have an artifact, a reference of a certain artifact type with a valid signature for a certain common name. So then, you're very specific to this container must be signed by this common name certificate. So if people add 1 million more signatures, some of them valid, some of them not, you don't care, because you're going to have that specific policy anyways. Obviously, we can't do that right now.
See Sajay have his hand up.
This was more of, thanks. This is more of a question, Eric. Can we start with default all, iron out the use case, and then kind of like make an issue to track warn as a change to this? Because what I'm thinking is I see this as a couple of different patterns here, right? Like say, for example, when you run an executable and if it's not signed, you definitely don't want to run it. It's just totally blocked, depending on the environment. Like if it's a secure access workstation, then no way you're going to get to run that executable, even if it's signed incorrectly. Versus a prod deployment that somebody actually attached the wrong signature. There are a couple of ways to fix it. Like you could drop the signature because it's detached, or you could go update the policy. And can we, do you want to hold off merging this, or do you want to track another issue to kind of like make progress? How do you want to go about it? That's kind of what my question is.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I mean, since the PR does represent the larger body of work of moving the policy to the plugin model, I think it's worth just going with it. And then if we need to change the default, we can, as long as it's explicitly called out when we do that, so that nobody gets surprised.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds reasonable. Yep.
Okay. The next PR, I published the charts with the, we released 0.1.3 alpha last week. And one of the new actions is that we'll be publishing the charts to the GitHub page. So I've have a PR to update the README file. Let me show the preview. So before, the instruction was cloning the repository and then installing Ratify. And then lastly, apply the constraint. Now we can just add the GitHub page as the Helm repo. My question though to Eric, with these steps, can the user customer easily override the configuration map? Like if they need to provide their own certificate or want to, like, say, play around with the policy?
I believe so. So in our chart, there's the values.yaml, and assuming that I think what we did, if I remember correctly, is we put our test certificate in the values.yaml. So for a different certificate, they can replace that there. For the policy, for the new changes to how policy works, if that, I don't remember in the PR if the chart got updated, but we'll have to update the config map to support the new changes to the policy provider. And then whatever makes sense to plumb in from a values file, we'll have to stub out.
I see.
Yeah, we'll have to update the chart to support the changes that are going to be merged from the policy provider. So if we want to let people put artifact types into values.yaml with whatever the policy they want there to be, we'll have to add some chart rendering to loop over that and add sections to where they should go.
Yeah. So should I, once this is reviewed and approved, should I go ahead and merge this and then track that as a separate PR to do the values configuration for the new policy?
Yes. Ideally, that comes as part of the policy provider change, since that's the change that would break the chart, the existing chart. But if we were okay with that chart being broken for a little bit, then you could merge that while we work on the updates to the chart.
Akash, go ahead.
So Eric, you're saying that we should add the ability for the user to specify the artifact type to policy mapping in the values.yaml instead. So the user wouldn't, I guess, update the chart on their end if they want a more advanced scenario beyond just the default we set.
Yeah, so the way I'm thinking about it right now, because right now the way it works is you specify a policy per artifact type, right?
Yep.
So we could add in the values.yaml. So I guess for your PR, at the very least, we should make sure that we update the config map so that the chart still installs and runs.
Yeah. I think it's updated unless I missed.
Okay.
But that for sure has to be changed.
Okay. And then, yeah, so if that's fine, then for now, that's probably fine. And then in the future, it would probably be nice to add, I'll let the user specify in values.yaml an array of artifact types and just plumb that into the policy.
Okay, sounds good. I can actually look into how much that's going to be extra right now if we just implemented that. So
okay. I think there might be an example in the verifiers for Notary. I think there was we use a similar approach for the public keys, because I think we allowed specifying the paths at least as an array.
Okay. I'll just take a look at that as well.
Thanks, Akash. Next PR to review is the review policy. So I think Sajay have linked me to the Cncf reviewing policy instructions. So I've based off a reviewing guide of the Cncf MD file. And I've taken chunks of the contribution MD file for the PR creation. So this blocks just come from a different document. And I've captured our current reviewing process right here. So basically everyone is encouraged to participate, and usually we'll get the contributor with the best knowledge of the code path to sign off. And if there's no activity in this 7-day period, then the maintainer would try to follow up and reassign if needed. So if you have any other suggestions, feel free to comment on this PR and I'll incorporate the feedback. And same thing with checklist. So the basic ones, does the affected code have unit test? Is there any documentation that we need to write for the new feature? And is there any version update required, etc.? Yeah. Any comments on the reviewing guideline?
Is this, you said this a PR is open,
Um,
or this already exists in our?
oh, this is a PR. So if
Okay.
I go back, this is the diff.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so feel free to comment later.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, moving to the discussion agenda items. So last week we talked about the, I think it was called SLSA provenance verification. Let me bring that issue up actually. Yep, there it is. And we talked about introducing supporting OPA policy as a policy engine. We spoke offline with Eric today, and just want to check with Eric, like if there's any other option to implement this to enable this scenario.
Oh yeah. So we had let's see. So today, before I left or went on leave, we had talked about integration of OPA into Ratify directly, and the motivation for that was being able to run in all contexts, like in CI/CD and local environment, in cluster. However, if we wanted to support, if we wanted to have the fastest path to having more complicated policy allowed, we had talked about adding a pass-through mode to Ratify. So that would be in cluster when we knew we were sitting behind some sort of admission controller. We could have Ratify do all of the verifications with all the verifiers against all of the requisite artifact types. And then we could bubble up the entire resulting payload serialized to the admission controller, in this case, Gatekeeper. And then from Gatekeeper, we could allow the application of Rego so that at least in the short term, we don't have to plumb that directly into Ratify. So that would.
So how would that impact our return time for OPA Gatekeeper? It seems like it would add a lot of processing.
So currently, the only time that we are short circuiting in Ratify is if we know that a policy is set to all and we hit an artifact that is that fails. If that never happens, or if we're set to any other policy, then we're going to process all of the artifact types for all the relevant verifiers anyways. And so the only added overhead that this will have is in serialization, that the payload will be longer. So right now we make some final decision based on all of the policies for all of the artifact types. And then we set that as the final decision at the top. So instead of having to take the time to do that, we would trade that in for the time to serialize a JSON response. So I don't know that would add a ton of additional overhead.
Okay. Well, I mean, if we were to take the output from Ratify and send that JSON payload, back to OPA Gatekeeper or whatever we send, whatever we all integrate later. But I'm for that because that would allow at the cluster level, without having to reinstall and reconfigure Ratify, it would allow cluster operators more flexibility in how they wrote their Rego to verify signatures, and it would give them more control at across different namespaces and everything like that, because they would now be able to use multiple constraint templates that had different scopes based on different payloads coming back from the Ratify layer. So I'm for this solution. I just was trying to figure out when you look at like a typical OPA, not Gatekeeper, but just OPA authorization solution, generally you put that decision point as close to where the authorization needs to be. So a lot of times that is integrating it directly with a Go library to, directly with Ratify in this case. But in this particular use case, I think there's a lot more flexibility gained by end users in the cluster who are managing these constraint templates if they can make a decision on the payload that Ratify sends back.
And I guess also for reference, we're already doing that. Our policy, we're already sending back something that we're validating via Rego and Gatekeeper, and our policy is just very simple. It just checks the final result rather than so we already having an example using this would be as simple as us adding a constraint and a constraint template to give people, hey, here's how you can consume the metadata that's coming back from Ratify, since we're already operating on it with a constraint and a template anyways. And then as we progress in adding the ability to have those policies directly in Ratify, that would enable the same scenarios in other like outside cluster environments.
So with this, at some point, do you see this overtaking the policies that are at the executor layer as well in Ratify? Would you ever expose those up inside the Rego?
Yeah, so that was sort of what I was thinking, is the policies that I can think of, or some of the scenarios that I could think of, start to get more complicated than it would be ideal to implement something against directly, especially when we already have, or when OPA exists to do that. So that's sort of where my thoughts are going, is if we can start moving into getting OPA integrated, then more of this policy, which some users might want to be complicated in the future, can lean on that OPA execution rather than us implementing our own primitives for policy definition. So in the short term, to unblock it, I was proposing a pass through to lean on the admission controller. So
yeah, I mean, I think that in the not polluting this too much to where we slip on a particular date that we want to have, I think long term the solution should be flexible enough to allow the any all policies and similar policies that are being done in the Ratify layer to bubble up to the Gatekeeper layer at some point.
Right. Yeah. So we could have a couple operating modes. We could have just straight pass through, where Ratify is going to run through all of the verifiers for all the artifact types, and it's going to give you everything. We could have
an aggregate JSON.
Yeah, so
Okay.
we could have like a mixed pass through where we are going to apply some amount of policy at the ratify layer and pass some aggregate back. So we could have sort of a mix and match approach. But yeah, as far as like for timeline, it makes more sense if we want to be faster to just pass through for now.
Okay. I mean,
And yeah,
go ahead.
and I think Eric, what we were also discussing was the policy at the ratify level would be necessary, especially in the CI/CD workflow when we don't have a gatekeeper to kind of apply the rego for us.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So that, and locally, if you're not in a cluster, if you're not sitting behind an admission controller, we still intend to support those use cases. So, on the local machine via CLI in a CI/CD pipeline, if we wanted to allow, any of the types of policies that would be best expressed via Rego to run in those contexts, we'll have to support OPA execution within Ratify directly anyways. So we'll still probably end up moving that direction. And then for this, so specifically for this,
Yeah. Yes, Eric, I wanted to run through this specific example. So for example, they want to make sure the build is from a specific branch, for example. Would the Rego be, let's say branch equals to release, or branch name contains release branch? Would that be the Rego?
Maybe. So I guess it depends. So if you are going to have, there's a couple different levels here. You could, in theory, you could have any metadata about the image exposed, like serialized through JSON and exposed to OPA. And then you could have OPA have essentially be the verifier. So for example, for the SPDX verifier, that consumes image metadata that is an artifact associated with the image, and it does some validation, and then that result is serialized, and that result could then be consumed by Rego policy. If we just wanted to expose certain types of artifacts directly to Rego policy, we could do that, but the verifier wouldn't really be a verifier. It would essentially just be a data shuffler, So we could do that, or we could, we could have a generic metadata verifier. Like, I think maybe that's what we talked about earlier, is if you have a generic metadata verifier that you could apply OPA policy to, then that could be a verifier that lives at the verifier level, but then that would still bubble something up that would be consumed at the policy level. So so in this scenario,
what would the verifier report look like?
Right. So if we assumed, for hypothetically, we have a verifier that works with this data type, and that verifier has its own configuration, and we say the build must come from this repo, and it must come from the master branch or from a branch prepended with release. Then we would assume that the verifier would check for that against this artifact type when it existed, and it would report, success or failure. So we could have that verifier append additional metadata when it gives its response, since that response type is flexible. But that would be how our like our existing paradigm, that's how this would fit into it today. If we wanted to let people do Rego based on metadata, sure. A lot of verifiers then just become, glorified serializer, deserializer layers. Like take SPDX and then convert it from tag value to JSON. And then assume that somebody will bake some giant Rego that operates on all of it. It just also gets a little complicated because I sort of view that as a little more brittle. Like if any of the verifiers change anything about how it works, or any of the data that's within them changes, then the Rego can break. So
in this scenario, like, is the schema in the Rego or in the verifier?
So let's see. So this is a format, right?
Yes. Let
yeah.
me bring out their sample example.
So this is just JSON in which they have, I assume they have some prescribed fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For example, like, let's say we're validating the builder.
Right. So yeah, so we could write a verifier for this type. If we did, since it's just JSON, we
so
could.
The question here that we're thinking of where these, I mean, we're thinking about bubbling up verifiers and changing how the verifier works, right?
Yeah, I guess the question here would be for, as an example, this format, but any format that conforms, that could be serialized to JSON, that has metadata. It's the question is, should we be writing verifiers for these, or is this something that we could just bubble up to Rego and let somebody write a policy for?
So, and so my first question would be, is there any non-functional requirement that would drive why we would want this in the verifier layer as opposed to the OPA gatekeeper layer? I mean, is there a performance difference? Is there a security least privilege or zero trust difference? Is there some other security standard that's driving why you'd want this out of the hands of the cluster operator and more inside the hands of whoever's managing the Ratify layer, which could still be the cluster operator? But I mean, that's, I guess, where I would be coming from with this. What is the benefit of having it in, or not, for that matter, in the Verify layer?
From a performance perspective, it's technically better to not run a verifier.
Okay.
A verifier is a sub-processed call that has to then reconstruct a lot of stuff in order to do what it's supposed to do. So it's actually, if we don't reconstruct anything, if we just deserialize the artifact, if we just get it and serialize it into the result, it's cheaper than calling a verifier from a performance perspective. It's technically more flexible, I would say, because like a verifier, you're writing code to validate something. And so if what you're wanting to validate changes, you have to change your implementation, versus with Rego, it's probably easier to change the Rego validation of some data type like this than changing the software implementation of a validation. So
okay. So what I'm hearing is that the verifier is not as, if we can do less in the verifier layer, we're better off performance wise. And
yes,
there's more flexibility since we're verifying using, functional code. There's more flexibility in doing this using the Rego layer, more flexibility there, I guess.
Yeah, the only the only thing we'd want to make sure is that we accounted for the possibility of like, to make sure that we organize the response, if we're going to do that, that we organize it in such a way that we don't have collisions between different like artifact types. Cause like you might have the same thing, you might have some of the same fields from here in, for example, the SPDX, like in the tag values. So as long as we made sure that we were conscious about how we bubble it all up, then I think it's acceptable to just take things that are metadata and provide them directly back to the policy executor.
Yeah.
And how do we do that because we don't, what's the format that we use today? We essentially make a big old list of verifier results, right? I think that's what we do. I'll have to.
Then you go through this list, but the list you have to interrogate each. There's like sub items within the list. List of objects.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure we just have an array, I think, of verifier results, and we just append to it for every single thing we call. And so you would have to sort back through it for, if you wanted to check this kind of thing. The other thing that might get complicated in the Rego, I guess, is if you don't do a verifier is artifact type, like multiple versions of the same artifact type. Like if you have certain, I don't know how complicated it is to do that Rego. If we had 6 different versions of this metadata, and you wanted to only consider the most recent version.
So like what would change? So with Rego, the way this should work is that when you create the constraint, you're going to focus on matching. The Rego will be matched to whatever the inbound JSON is. So if the types change, you have a decision to make. Whether you're going to write a Rego that looks at multiple types, which you can certainly do, or you're going to write Rego using multiple different constraints. You're going to write different Rego for different types or different versions thereof. So if the metadata in this JSON example here changes based on the different version of a type or a different type, then you have a decision to make whether you want to, and it's more of a blast radius and regression decision more than anything, and how complex you want to write your Rego.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of specifically, I'm thinking specifically of certain artifact types that you might, like the same form, like the same version of, but you might have many of them. Like for container scanning, like you might have scans that happen to the same container image every week. And so you might have newer scan results that you need to only process the most recent version, or the most recent posted scan result, but you might have 50 scan result artifact types. So I just didn't know if that was more complicated in Rego than having to add it as implementation.
Yeah, I mean, Rego is going to, you can loop through, like you said, a list of objects and look for the latest, but ideally, if we could, filter that out in the verifier layer and only send the latest, that would be interesting as well.
Right. So that would be the only point that off the top of my head, the only point that I have in favor of still doing some amount of verifier versus just bubbling is if there's certain complexity that is harder to deal with in Rego, then there would be programmatically, especially if it required consideration of multiple artifacts, that'd be easier to do with the verifier. So, plus we would be bubbling this pretty far, at least right now. Like, since we don't have OPA directly in Ratify, and if we would plan on doing the pass through in the short term, we would have to bubble this all the way to gatekeeper, which is not bad.
It's not bad, but I'm wondering, I think up until now, I've been thinking that is mutually exclusive, right? Either do it in verifier or bubble it up to OPA gatekeeper, because of how we could manage the constraints and constraint templates. But it seems to me that we could almost as easily manage the Rego that we wanted to apply at the verifier layer. So if we had a way to change or add multiple Rego policies that would be picked up by specific verifiers, that to me, and if it was as easy to maintain at that level as it was to maintain constraints and constraint templates, then I'd be open to that as well. I mean,
yeah, I think the only thing is it would be in a current architecture, it would be not harder to change. It would just require more steps, because you have to rebuild and redeploy, since the Rego would have to be within the Ratify container. I mean, I guess it wouldn't have to be, but
well, I wonder, I mean, because the original way that OPA worked with Kubernetes was to have a sidecar in the pod. It was a kube, they called it kube management sidecar. And one of the things it did was it would look at config maps that were tagged as being Rego in the namespace, and it would compile the Rego and verify it's compilable, and then it would insert it into the OPA. So I'm wondering if that's something that we can leverage, or or does it have to be different? I don't know, but that's.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, we could make it pluggable. Like we could make it so you could hand us Rego at runtime.
I mean, that's what I would like to do. I mean, if we were going to do something like this, I would like to be able to manage it with Kubernetes primitives, like a config map or something, and allow OPA to have it compiled and pushed into OPA. Maybe we could reuse kube management for that. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't think this is an MVP thing though.
Yeah. So I would say, at least I would probably wait on this, on the definitive answer to this particular one, at least until we've hit MVP, because that's it kind of opens up a can of worms, and it's specific to, like, for verifiers that have to do other stuff, like the signature validation ones. They have to open up, they have to deserialize something, and they have to do some signature validation. So there's like actual stuff to do. But with all these other things where they're just like, here's a bunch of metadata, there are multiple ways to do it. So
yeah, one of the goal was to not build anything schema specific. So yeah, we'll just keep that in mind. And the other thing that I was meant to do, but I have not done, is actually to reach out to Sertac, who created the issue, to understand his vision of how we're going to support this. So let me do that this week, and I'll provide an update next week. Okay. Any other comment before we move on to the next? Okay.
No.
All right, next item. The last item is the support of dynamic configuration. This is a pretty old issue, item number 9. So last week we talked about implementing it initially with Firewatcher, and Eric and I and Akash, we talked about it a little bit this morning, that the interface of the executor will need to be modified so it can watch for the changes and mutate itself, or I think what's the term that you used, Eric? Self-mutating executor.
So we need the essentially the interface, or the executor and the verifiers aren't set up right now. The interfaces don't lend themselves to you changing them. It's just kind of like okay, the executor exists, here you go, you can start to use it. But like the example I was thinking of is, let's say for Notary, we wanted to add a PEM file, or we wanted to add a public key to the list of public keys. We could add, there's a Go package that will watch a file and tell you if something updated. But our interface, so we could add that, but our interface for the executor and all the verifiers doesn't necessarily allow us to say, hey, we need to give us the instance of the Notary verifier from your array so that we can call its .add PEM method. I think regardless of the route we take, whether it's file watcher or whether it's plugging, getting CRDs in through adding Cube Builder, we will have to think about how we expose, or how we allow ourselves to access all of the stuff in here.
Yeah, I'm just gonna bring up the handler on my screen here. Like in the executor, we currently have the store, the policy, the verifier, and the config. So once the configuration changes, would this trigger like a update on all these objects inside the struct?
I mean, we could look at the parts depending on what we had available. Like if we assume the file watcher tells us, what part changed, or we could figure that out on our own. We wouldn't necessarily have to update everything. Certainly in the case of like the CRDs, when we're inside of the cluster, the CRD will only be for a specific thing. So like for a verifier, we might have a CRD that lets you add a public key to Notary, or the same thing for just the raw config on disk. If we do the file watcher, all you would have to do is access verifier. So you can, I guess, because verifiers, the executor verifiers array is public, I guess you could get access to, you could just iterate through that.
How do we audit this?
Audit the changes to the...
Yeah, because what we're effectively saying here, it sounds to me, is that we're going to change the way that the executor is going to work, right? We're going to possibly change the policy enforcer, the verifier. To me, that is changing, how we are verifying inbound artifacts. So to me, I want a audit trail of how this changed. I mean, if we change a CRD, we get that audit trail via the Kube API server audit logs. What do we have for these types of changes?
So that's I think when we're in cluster, that would be right now I can't think of a case where we would update when outside the cluster, we would need to update an existing process. So like in CI/CD or locally, you might just call Ratify, but you're not going to leave it running and update its config. The only time you're really going to do that is in cluster. And the North Star, at least for me, there would be to have CRD based updates. So I think the file watcher,
all right.
The file watcher, I think, was just something that we had suggested originally, that you technically could use both in cluster and out of cluster to get the same result. If we said that we only really cared about being able to update things in cluster, then we could just go the CRD route for at least for the auditing. The only thing is, in either case, I was just thinking about, would we need to make any changes here to allow ourselves to elegantly update the executor. And I guess the answer may be no. If you, we have the verifier trait as well, or not trait, interface. Because I guess if it's all public, we could just walk through all of it.
Would it be here?
Yeah, so we're making verifiers. Oh, it's VR, it's reference verifier, package verifier. I don't know if the autocomplete has it.
Okay, let me go to the web interface. I feel like sometimes
It has good completion.
yeah, or do you know the path of it?
Yeah, I think it's package verifier. Is there type? Or it's either types or it might be reference. No, that's. Is it API? I think it might be API.
Yep.
Reference verifier, yeah. So we only give the struct. So that's the verifier result, but reference verifier. Yeah, so we rely on just that interface. So like we would have to, for each individual verifier that we'd want to update, we would have to have some implementation that knew how to deal with that specific verifier. Unless we added to the interface a method to update and pass the generic config, then that would.
Sounds like we would need a design doc for this.
Yeah.
For sure.
So essentially, yeah, for being able to update stuff, step one is how do we get the update and how do we know that it happened? And then step two is how do we actually do something about it? So
yeah, Eric, are you happy to work on the design for this refactoring?
yeah, I can do that. So I'll make a note.
Oh, I can assign this issue to you.
Yes, we have an issue. Yeah.
In our review guide, the first thing I think in the note is like, if you're working on something, leave a comment so that others are notified. Let me find the issue. I think it's issue number 9. Okay, I'm not signed in. I'll sign in later and try to figure out how to, or you can self-assign.
Okay. Yeah, I'll hop in. And
yeah, and we can discuss more next week once you have looked into the issue a bit more.
Cool.
We're almost at time. Any other items to discuss, anyone?
That's all I had.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a good week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.